Chapter 8 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 8, John Charles Frémont, Part 1. The Pathfinder. The discovery and exploration of the trans-Mississippi region had many phases, the outcome of different conditions and varying individual efforts to determine the extent, possibilities, and resources of the undeveloped half of the American continent. The seamanship of Gray, the enthusiasm of Lewis, the courage of Clark, the assiduity of Pike, the enterprise of Ashley, Wyeth, Sublette, Bonneville, and other trappers and traders had done much to make known to the pioneer and settler the advantages and promise of the Great West, and had thoroughly delineated the routes of travel best suited for the emigrant in his westward march. In time many urged that the government of the United States, so long shamefully negligent of its magnificent acquisitions by purchase, discovery, and settlement, should enter in and possess its own. This, however, necessitated, first, a systematic examination of the physical features of the West to such an extent as to render possible its general and authoritative description; second, the granting of lands on homesteads to such of its daring citizens as might be willing to venture their lives as settlers in these remote regions. Among public men who urged most strongly such action was one of the most distinguished of our Western statesmen, Thomas H. Benton, first Senator from the new and growing State of Missouri. He persistently advocated the settlement of the lower Columbia by Americans, the enforcement of the title of the United States to the Pacific Coast region from California northward to the 49th parallel, and in 1825 he presented in the Senate a bill authorizing the use of the Army and Navy to protect American interests in Oregon. In season and out of season, Benton opposed the joint occupation of Oregon by England and America, unfailingly supporting every measure which promised to fill its fertile valleys with American settlers. So dominant was this idea in Benton's career that artistic skill has fittingly shaped his statue in St. Louis with its bronze hand pointing west, with his prophetic words carved on the pedestal, "There is the East, there is India." In his efforts to put his ideas into practical shape, Benton threw the great weight of his influence as a senator toward the employment in such explorations of a member of his family by marriage, John Charles Frémont, whose ability and inclination specially suited him for the scientific examination and exploration of the trans-Mississippi region. Born January 21, 1813, at Savannah, Georgia, Frémont entered Charleston College, where his disregard of discipline prevented his graduating, although the faculty later honored him with the degrees of Bachelor and Master of Arts. Well grounded in the classics and familiar with the ordinary astronomical methods of determining latitude and longitude, Frémont visited South America on the United States ship Natchez as a teacher. Later, appointed a professor of mathematics in the Navy, he declined the position to accept more congenial service as assistant engineer of the United States Topographic Corps, where he had experience in preliminary surveys of railroads and also in a military reconnaissance among the Cherokees in Georgia. Commissioned in the United States Army in 1838 as second lieutenant in the Topographic Corps, his initial service was fortunately as principal assistant to I.N. Nicolet in the survey of the country between the Mississippi and the Missouri. Nicolet, an able and distinguished engineer, was the first explorer in America who made general use of the barometer for determining elevations of the great interior country, and his map of this region was one of the greatest contributions ever made to American geography. In 1841, Frémont married Jessie Benton, a daughter of Senator Benton, through whose influence Frémont was assigned to the command of the expedition ordered to explore the country between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains on the line of the Kansas and Platte Rivers. In May, 1842, while Frémont was on the frontier making preparations for the journey, there came, as Mrs. Frémont relates, an order recalling him to Washington. Mrs. Frémont sent a special messenger to her husband, advising him to move immediately for good and sufficient reasons, to be given later. Meanwhile, holding the letter, she wrote the colonel who had given the order for the recall that she had neither forwarded the order nor informed Frémont of it, as she knew that obedience thereto would ruin the expedition. On such a small thread of circumstances hung the fate of his first separate command, which brought Frémont into such great prominence in connection with the exploration and development of the Pacific Coast region. The journey of Frémont lay up the North Fork of the Platte, through South Pass, into Wind River Valley, his march being marked by the usual experiences of hardship and suffering inseparable from the time and region. The most notable event of the journey was the ascent of the main and highest peak of the Wind River Range, now known as Frémont's Peak. Their first attempts were unsuccessful, the party suffering from great cold, excessive fatigue, and mountain fever resulting from the rarity of the air. Frémont, however, persevered and succeeded. He describes the final ascent as follows: "We reached a point where the buttress was overhanging, and there was no other way of surmounting the difficulty than by passing around one side of it, which was the face of a vertical precipice of several hundred feet. Putting hands and feet in the crevices between the blocks, I succeeded in getting over it, and when I reached the top found my companions in a small valley below. Descending to them, we continued climbing, and in a short time reached the crest. I sprang upon the summit, and another step would have precipitated me into an immense snow field 500 feet below. At the edge of this field was a sheer icy precipice, and then, with a gradual fall, the field sloped off for about a mile until it struck the foot of another lower ridge. I stood on a narrow crest about 3 feet in width. As soon as I had gratified the first feelings of curiosity, I descended, and each man ascended in turn, for I would only allow one at a time to mount the unstable and precarious slab, which it seemed a breath would hurl into the abyss below. We mounted the barometer in the snow at the summit, and fixing a ramrod in the crevice, unfurled the national flag to wave in the breeze where never flag waved before. The elevation of this summit, as determined by Frémont, was 13,570 feet. His success on this expedition caused his most favorable reception by the War Department on his return to the States. Frémont's second expedition contemplated the connection of his first explorations with those made by Captain Wilkes on the Pacific coast, so as to give a connected survey across the interior of North America. The party which left Kansas City May 29, 1843, consisted of 40 men, equipped with 12 carts for transportation and a light wagon for scientific instruments. The route followed was up the valley of the Kansas River, thence by the South Fork of the Platte to the vicinity of the present city of Denver. After considerable hesitation, a northerly route was taken, skirting the westerly limits of the great Laramie Plain, which brought Frémont to the emigrant trail in the vicinity of the South Pass. The volume of travel toward the Pacific coast even at that early date may be estimated from his description of the Oregon Trail as a broad, smooth highway where the numerous heavy wagons of the emigrants have entirely beaten and crushed the mountain sage. Crossing Green River and following up Ham's Fork, Frémont reached the valley of Bear River, the principal tributary of Great Salt Lake, which was filled with emigrants traveling to the lower Columbia River. Frémont expressed his surprise at the confidence and daring of the emigrants as he met in one place a family of 2 men and women and several children traveling alone through such a country so remote from civilization. Turning south from this point and quitting the traveled road, Frémont visited the Great Salt Lake, of which he says, "Hitherto this lake had been seen only by trappers who were wandering through the country in search of new beaver streams, caring very little for geography. Its lands had never been visited, and none were to be found who had entirely made the circuit of its shores, and no instrumental observations of geographical survey of any description had ever been made anywhere in the neighboring region. It was generally supposed that the lake had no visible outlet, but among the trappers, including those in my own camp, were many who believed that somewhere on its surface was a terrible whirlpool, through which its waters found their way to the ocean by some subterranean communication." The lake was eventually reached from the lower part of Bear River in an India rubber canoe, by means of which Frémont also landed on a mountainous island near the center of the lake, where, from an elevation of 800 feet, he was able to determine with considerable accuracy the contours and extent of this remarkable body of water. Instead of a tangled wilderness of shrubbery teeming with an abundance of game, as the party expected, the island proved to be broken, rocky land, some 12 miles in circumference, on which there was neither water nor trees. A few saline shrubs and other hardy plants formed the only vegetation. The lake is described as being enclosed in a basin of rocky mountains, which sometimes leave grassy fields and extensive bottoms between them and the shore, while in other places they come directly down to the water in bold and precipitous bluffs. He speaks of the water of the lake being at a low stage, and the probabilities that the marshes and low ground are overflowed in the season of high water. Frémont says that "we felt pleasure in knowing that we were the first who in the traditional annals of the country had visited the island and broke with joyful sound the long solitude." But in view of the dissipation of his dream of fertility, he named it Disappointment Island. Turning northward, Frémont reached, on September 18, 1843, Fort Hall, Idaho, then a post under British control, whose original importance as an Indian trading post had been greatly enhanced by its location on the emigrant route to Oregon, at a distance of over 1,300 miles from the then frontier settlement of Westport, Missouri. Following closely the emigrant trail, Frémont, on October 8th, passed Fort Boise, then occupied by the Hudson Bay Company, and on the 25th of the month arrived at another trading establishment of this company, at the junction of the Walla Walla and Columbia rivers. This was considered by emigrants as the practical termination of their overland journey, since navigation down the river was rapid and convenient. Frémont found many American immigrants at Fort Vancouver on his visit to that post, and also learned that others already occupied the adjacent lowlands of the Willamette Valley. Moreover, these pioneers were not confining their efforts to Oregon, for while small parties were pushing southward through that valley to settlements in northern California, still others, making detours near Fort Hall, reached by a more direct route through passes in the Sierra Nevada, the banks of the Sacramento. On November 10, 1843, Frémont left Vancouver to return to the United States, having in view an entirely new route whereby he might be able to complete the exploration of the great interior basin between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. His party then consisted of 25. Leaving the Columbia at a point above the Dalles, Frémont followed Deschutes River to its source, and passing over to Lake Klamath, contemplated a journey to and a winter camp on either Mary's Lake or the mythical Buenaventura River. His trail brought him to Lake Klamath, and later to Goose Lake, the source of the Sacramento. Winter had now commenced, the weather in the mountains proved to be extremely cold, snowstorms became frequent, and his search for Mary's Lake and Buenaventura River proved fruitless and dangerous. These mythical watercourses, which had been eliminated from the domain of geography by Bonneville's map of 1837, proved indeed to be veritable waters of the desert, mere mirages that nearly led Frémont to an untimely fate. Frémont's frequent allusions in his field journal to these imaginary streams show his then belief in their existence, which appears extraordinary in view of existing publications. In Bonneville's maps are charted with general accuracy the great interior basins of the Great Salt, Mud, and Sevier lakes, the Humboldt and Sevier rivers. The general extent and direction of the Willamette, Sacramento, and San Joaquin rivers are indicated, and the non-existence of the Buenaventura and other hypothetical streams was conclusively determined. The existence of these maps was generally known, and their absence from Frémont's topographic outfit is remarkable, a most unfortunate omission, as Benton, in his 30 Years' View, describes Frémont's charts and geographic information as disastrously erroneous. Struggling along in the snow through a forest of unknown extent, Frémont halted, on December 16th, on the verge of a rocky precipice, from which the party looked down more than 1,000 feet upon a broad lake, the most westerly waters of the great interior basin, which, from its pleasing contrast to the wintry weather of the Sierra Nevada, they called Summer Lake. Attempting to travel in an easterly direction, Frémont found himself beaten back by an impassable country, there being rocky, sterile mountains on either side, which obliged him to keep to the south through a wild, barren, and uninhabited region. Frémont, describing the country, says: "On both sides the mountains showed often stupendous and curious looking rocks, which at several places so narrowed the valley that scarcely a pass was left for the camp. It was a singular place of travel through, shut up in the earth, a sort of chasm, the little strip of grass under our feet, the rough walls of bare rock on either hand, and the narrow strip of sky above." The year 1844 opened with the party in a forlorn and dispirited condition, as they were practically lost in the tangle of the valleys and mountains. The grass had become so scanty and unwholesome that the overtaxed animals fell ill. Some died and others were stolen by Indians, so that the party lost 15 head of stock by the time they reached Pyramid Lake, where they camped from the 10th to the 16th of January. Here they found grass abundant, firewood plentiful, and from an Indian village they obtained salmon trout, a feast to the famished men. The Indians indicated the general direction of the route out of the desolate country, but no one would consent to accompany the party as guide. The region traversed continued so rough and lamed the animals so badly that on the 18th Frémont determined to abandon the easterly course, thinking it advisable to cross the Sierra Nevada to the valley of the Sacramento by the first practicable pass. Now and then a few Indians were met, and finally a guide was obtained, who led them to the southward over a low range of mountains through a snow-covered pass into what proved to be Carson Valley. The snow deepened and the country became so broken as to make progress difficult, long, tedious detours necessary, and soon travel was only possible along high and exposed ridges, which were comparatively snow free. Finally, it became necessary to abandon their mountain howitzer at an impracticable cañon that led into a valley which Frémont at first erroneously supposed to be to the westward of the Sierra Nevada. Continuing on without a guide, they met other Indians, who stated it was impossible to cross the mountains on account of the deep snow, but after much persuasion, and by means of large presents, an Indian guide was finally induced to undertake the journey. Frémont, fully conscious of the desperate conditions, which entailed the possible death of all, endeavored to encourage his men by reminding them of the contrast between the fast-falling snow of the surrounding Sierra Nevada and the flower-clad meadows in the adjacent valley of the Sacramento, and informed them that his astronomical observations showed that they were only 60 miles distant from Sutter's great establishment. Their provisions were now practically exhausted. Neither tallow, grease, nor salt remained, and even their hunting dogs were killed for food. Making the best of the situation, their clothing and outfit were put in the best of order, and on February 2nd, crossing the frozen river on the ice, the party commenced the ascent of the mountain, the men, Frémont relates, being unusually silent over the hazardous and doubtful enterprise. 10 men mounted on the strongest horses broke the road, each man in succession opening the path, either on foot or on horseback, until he and his horse became exhausted. When he dropped to the rear, the very deep snow made it impossible to follow the main valley, and they necessarily worked along steep and difficult mountain sides. On the third day the snow had become so deep that their best horses gave out entirely, refusing to make further effort. The day ended with the party at a standstill and the camp equipage strewed along the route. Too exhausted to make huts, they camped that night without shelter and suffered bitterly from the unusual cold, as the temperature fell to 22 degrees below freezing. 2 Indians who had joined the party expatiated on the impossibility of crossing at this point, and the guide, influenced by them, deserted the party the next morning. End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Recording by William Tomco.